Hey guys, welcome back. So today we actually have quite a bit to go through, so I'm not going to waste any time getting into it, but we're going to be talking about dual relationships and other kind of boundary issues. Okay, so let me uh, make sure I click on the right things and get started here. So, wait, this is, oh yeah, we're going to talk about boundaries. I'm going to hide that behind my my live captioning here. So, as it says above, put your seatbelt on, or if you prefer Arnold, buckle up. Oh yeah, there we go. Now he's moving. Now he's putting on the paint. He's ready to go. What we're going to be doing here is what we're trying to do here is increase our tolerance and our capacity for ambiguity, because the longer we can tolerate this confusion, the more we can consider we have these two roles that we're trying to fit in, and I need to decide, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it too much risk? And how long can I tolerate that and make a decision that I can be confident in? Okay. So it says up here, the stronger your intellect will get. Yes, it's the intellect. Our intellect is the thing that takes in information, but our emotions are also the one that we feel confused, we feel overwhelmed and scared. Somebody recently just said, it'll probably will have talked about this in class last week, but somebody told me recently that they get to this place where it's so much information, it seems so ambiguous, and they just have this tendency to want to shut down and be like, ugh, throw up your hands, get frustrated, and then withdraw from the situation just because you're overwhelmed by it. And that makes complete sense. And I hear that so much in classes like this, where people are just frustrated with, like, I thought there was a clear answer. Why doesn't the code give me a clear answer? Why doesn't it just tell me what to do? I should rely on my supervisors to tell me what to do. And yes, we can have the code as a helpful guide, and we can have supervisors to say, well, this is what I've done in the past, and here's what I do now. And we take in all that information, and that's a great help. But what we're trying to do is get to the place where we can tolerate all this different information, make independent choices, and say, you know what, this is what I'm going to do based on the information I have right now, even though I might change my mind later on if I have other information or something like that. So that's what I mean. I use the word maturity. It could be, people say you're experienced enough to be able to make these decisions and to know how to navigate these situations. But that's what we're really working towards. Okay. So we're going to get uncomfortable. We're going to buckle up because we need a little safety net as we go through these kind of things. But just know frustration, intolerance, confusion, anger, that kind of stuff is pretty normal as we're going through learning how to handle these different situations. One more thing about boundaries is we're going to talk about like the definition of boundaries, but and that's like the skeleton. But we're going to give a whole bunch of examples of what actually are these boundary violation areas, which is sort of put the flesh on the bones, so to speak. And that's what's really going to hopefully help this come alive to us. But I'm going to give you a few analogies here of what boundaries are. First of all, you can think of boundaries as Brene Brown does in this sort of, she's a you guys probably have heard of her, but she's a social worker and talks about this therapy kind of stuff. And she says boundaries are simply what's okay and not okay to do with me or to do around me and that kind of thing. It's you can't use that language with me. You can't engage in those behaviors when I'm around. I'm just not okay with that. This is what I'm willing to accept, and this is what I'm not. Another definition of boundaries is think of just a fence. Robert Frost has a famous poem uh, called Fences. I think it's called Fences. Dang it now. No, it's called Mending Wall. And he says, good fences make good neighbors. In other words, if we have a boundary, then we know where our properties lie and we know how not to accidentally cross over it and piss somebody off, right? So a fence is something that keeps the neighbor's dog from peeing on your lawn and the deer from getting in to eat your garden. Those are good things. It keeps the bad stuff out. It also can keep the good stuff in. Another example of boundaries is your skin. I've heard somebody use this as an analogy before. Your skin keeps out germs, it keeps out bacteria, it keeps out all kinds of stuff that you don't really want to get on the inside of your body. Because if it does, you'll get an infection, and bad bacteria should not live in your body. So we have skin to protect us, right? That's the part of the point of it. It also keeps all of your blood and your guts and all kinds of weird, gross body stuff in because you don't want your organs like flopping out. So your skin has an important job to keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. As it relates to this context, we want to keep too much risk from getting into the counseling relationship because we can tolerate some risk. Some risk is good and it's okay, but not too much, because too much makes things hard and complicated and it creates too much difficulty, right? We want to keep the relationship keep it solid, and keep it stable. That's the whole point here. So we're navigating between these things, trying to figure out where our fence is going to sit. That's the idea here. So I'm going to move this again so you can kind of see the title here, but dual relationships. Let's give it a definition. Let's bring out that skeleton. The definition that we're going to use here for what a dual relationship is multiple roles with a client. And we're going to go through, again, putting kind of flesh on the bones, so to speak. I'm not going to dig too far into this, but multiple roles can mean a lot of different things. In certain contexts, you're going to have to wear multiple roles, or I don't know, be in multiple roles, wear different hats. I think I'm trying to mix my analogies here. You're going to have multiple roles. Example, when you're doing interviews with clients, you're doing an assessment with them, you're kind of an objective observer. In other words, you're not biased towards or against them. You're trying to get the facts as they stand. What are the behaviors that I see? What is the report the client's giving me? Are there symptoms that I can judge to be unhealthy or healthy based on diagnoses and that kind of stuff? So there's a certain part of us that we want to be an objective observer, an objective interviewer, so to speak. And then there's this other part of us that's therapeutic, where we say, well, we don't want to be objective. We want to be very biased. We want to have non-judgmental positive regard. It's a very biased thing to do, but that's kind of how therapy works. Another way to say non-judgmental positive regard, in kind of a different light, it's not the same thing, but unconditional love. There's nothing that you can do that will change the way I see you positively. Okay, so clients relapse, they come in and they say weird stuff. They have all these symptoms that are creating coping strategies or defense mechanisms that we find to be kind of obnoxious, or that they're wrecking relationships in their lives with other people. And we say, yeah, you do all that stuff, but there's a reason for that. And we're going to tolerate that because I see the good in you. And so we're going to hold these different roles. We're going to allow for risky things to happen in the relationship in a way that we can tolerate, so that we can actually be beneficial or helpful. Okay. So there's lots of different examples of multiple roles, and that's what we'll go through as we get into this even more. It used to be that the rest of this slide is kind of about this premise. It used to be that dual relationships were seen as bad. You shouldn't have them. There's no place for them in counseling. Okay. It's because they're complex. And if we can just avoid the complexity and the risk, why even get into it? Well, let me skip down here just a little bit to the second sub bullet point here, and I'll come back to the first one. There's a continuum of some boundary violations or some dual relationships, I should say. I'm your therapist, but I'm also, example we used in class, I'm your therapist and your lover. Extremely harmful, right? Bad, and there's zero circumstances where that is really okay, right? So, however, there are circumstances in which I'm your therapist, but I also, you asked me to come to your graduation after years of therapy. School has been so hard. The family's really supportive, and they say, can you step outside of your therapist role and support me by coming to my graduation and watching me walk across the stage? In those cases, there's actual real benefit that could happen. And so there's some situations where you engage in dual relationships where benefit is possible. Okay. So the field, and I'll actually jump down here and get myself out of the way for just a second. The field has recognized that dual relationships maybe are not all bad. In contemporary practice, we need to be a little bit more fluid and flexible to have a frame of reference, so we can consider the pros and the cons and not just consider all of the stuff really terrible. Okay. Part of the complexity, skipping back up a little bit, is that they can be really difficult to recognize when we're in them, when we're engaging in multiple different roles. Remember just a minute ago when I was like, you're an interviewer that's objective and non-biased, and then you're also a therapist who's biased and in a positive way, right? Sometimes it can be hard to tell what is my task right now, what is my job, what is my role. And as we go through, you'll find yourself, as you work into your future work or practices, you'll find yourself getting into situations where you're like, well, what am I doing here? Am I in this role or that role? Sometimes can really be hard to tell. So we'll try and tease out what is your job description, what is your scope of practice, The scope of practice of a counselor within a profession can sometimes be determined by state law, by code of ethics, by your specific community, and also by your local licensing board. So there's just so many different things that can impact. It can also be determined by your specific job description. This is one for you school counselors. So Claire, I'm talking to you right now. When you're a school counselor and you say, I was trained to do this therapeutic stuff, but my job says I'm just doing guidance counseling and I'm just doing, scheduling and helping coach with some, conflict on the football team. And maybe I'm doing some college readiness tours with kids, but not therapy, right? Sometimes administrators don't understand the full professional scope of our practice, but our job description creates some conflict between what is our actual role, and that can create some weird dual relationship kind of things that maybe we don't even recognize when they're happening. Okay, so digging into the complexity here already. Look at third bullet point down here. Some of these are unavoidable. Some you can't help it. We'll go into examples here, so I'll not get into those too much. And then I kind of already mentioned this thing about traditional ways of thinking have changed a little bit to allow for that more fluidity and flexibility. So again, now we're going to talk about the code. I'm actually going to get out of this slide here and bring up the actual code to look at these a little bit more, but here are the ones we're going to look at. So if you want to pull this up too, follow along with me, absolutely, please do that. This is the ACA Code of Ethics. I also have the ASCA Code of Ethics pulled up here too, but A5, A6, and A7. There's more relevant ones, but we're just going to kind of keep it simple at first. And we're going to start now pulling up this code and digging through this a little bit. So let me do that. Get out of this one. Pull up this guy. Of course, it's on the wrong screen. Okay. Here's A5. When we're talking about dual relationships, we're talking about, in this context, prohibited non-counseling. Hold on, I want to make sure I can actually see this. Yeah, you guys can see this. Prohibited non-counseling roles and relationships. Okay, so the first one, sexual or romantic relationships are prohibited. All right, that's pretty clear. We're going to get into that in a little bit, talk a little bit more specifically about that. All of this section 5 is about this. Okay, so we'll come back to this one, but that's holding two roles. Again, two roles. That's therapist and romantic partner. Hopefully you already can see a little bit about why that's freaking weird, but there's somebody out there who needs to hear this, so we'll go through it. A6 is managing and maintaining boundaries in a professional relationship. Okay, so let's think about this one. Counselors consider the risks and benefits. Notice it doesn't say you do not get into these situations. It says consider the risks and the benefits of accepting clients, those with whom you have had previous relationships. So what does that mean? Maybe you, let's say you go to church or you are in a book club and someone finds out you're a therapist and you're like, oh man, you could really help me. Can I come in and see you as a client so you can talk? We've been talking about, this challenge I have with my kids or this issue I have with these people around me, whatever it might be. Can I come in and spend some time with you? And you say, well, that's going to change the nature of our relationship because there's certain kind of like confidentiality things that I have to uphold. And that's going to make it either really hard for me. And I don't know if I can maintain that confidentiality given the way we interact during this book club or in our church or whatever it might be. Or you say, it's really hard for clients to figure out who I am in this setting and who I am in other one and how I act differently because of that. But it can be really complicated, messy. But again, risks and benefits, right? You can kind of weigh those out. One example, just to kind of give one, is that let's say you're in a book club with somebody and then there's a school shooting and one of their kids was at the school but not harmed, but they're freaking out about it. Can you use your counseling skills to support them in kind of a crisis situation? Probably. I'm not going to say yes, but I'm going to say probably because it's context dependent, right? But in those situations, you may decide, yep, I can engage in some more of this like counseling like stuff. But in other situations, you might say, nope, this doesn't feel right. It's not fitting based on what we're seeing here. Okay. Here's some more examples. I'm not going to go through these all, but we can read through those. Um, Extending counseling boundaries. And I'm not going to read through this whole thing just for the sake of time, but this is something you should look at and should read through. You don't have to memorize it. Just kind of have read through it once. Make sure you read. Here's a good idea. Read through the code and just kind of see them all. Get a sense for what is in there. And then as we go through scenarios in the class and in your practices, you'll get a much more in-depth understanding. But every time you come back to this document, not only does it change from time to time because they update it, but it'll change the way you look at it based on the situations you've been in and the experiences you've had. So it's really kind of a living, breathing, organic document. And the way you understand it just continually grows and matures over time, the more you spend time in it. Okay. That doesn't mean like put this by your bedstand and read it every night. It's so boring. You would not want to do that. That would be a terrible idea. But it does mean just have it available, know where it's at, and periodically just check in with it. I do this still. I open it up and I'm like, okay, I have this thing going on with clients and or students in class or something. Is there anything in here that I'm missing? What could I be focusing on a little bit more? And I do that. I don't know how often I do it now, but I semi-regular. Okay. Again, good practice. Whenever you get in weird situations that you're sort of unsure of, write it down. We'll go through some decision-making models in class and we'll practice writing things down, and how you document those, and how you document them really is a way to express your understanding of risks and benefits. It'd be a really great thing to do. I know there's the sentiment out there that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And it can be really scary to write some of these things down because you're worried about making the right decision or not. But if you can write it down, work through, here's at least why I made the decision. As long as I'm open to saying I might have missed the mark there, I might have got it wrong, it can be really helpful to do that. So, role changes in the professional relationship. Scan through here to see when you go through for the first session with your client and you give them your informed consent and you say, this is what the counseling relationship is going to be like, and then something happens to change it. For example, you meeting with an individual client, but then their spouse comes in and they want to do family counseling, as it says here, kind of in the way again. Here, let me get out of the way completely. You change from an evaluative role to a therapeutic role. This used to be really relevant when I would get hired to do assessments in a forensic setting. So attorney would hire me to work with their client, not my client, but I would be doing an evaluation of something like their employability. After an accident, they used to be an electrician and now they can't do the work of an electrician because they lost an arm in an accident or something, or they have a back injury or whatever. And now I'm saying, well, they can't be an electrician, but here's what they can do. And then I'm save the example of all the things that I was doing in that evaluation, but I was objective, right? And there were a few times where people were like, well, do you provide other kind of services? And I say, yeah, I'm a therapist and I could see clients. And they're like, well, can I come see you? And I'm like, well, that's going to change the nature of our relationship. I go from an evaluation to a therapeutic role. And so it changes the way I interact with people and the things I can do with and for them. Okay. Also, going from being a counselor to a mediator. If those of you who are doing couples work, that's something you'll want to pay a little bit of attention to. Okay. So just some basic ideas. Let's skip past A6E. A7 is relevant too when we're doing advocacy for people. By the time you see this, we should have talked about a model for advocacy. So if I'm doing things on behalf of my client and I'm advocating for them, that sometimes can change the nature of the relationship, even though, as I said before, it can be really beneficial to use your power, your status, and your skills to advocate for clients that are yours, but it changes the way that they will see you. It changes the nature of the relationship too. So just be mindful of that. Again, not all bad. Okay, so that's probably good enough. Let's look at the AFCA code. I'm not going to go through this fully because a lot of these things are pretty similar, but oh, that was a little whiplash there. Sorry about that. Sustaining healthy relationships and boundaries. Let's just kind of pick out some of these. And again, this is for you, Claire, but if I use this video for another year, it can be, for any other students as well. There's all these unique school counseling situations, like when people go from one school to the next. Whether let's say you work in a middle school and this person goes to high school and they come back and they're like, "Oh, you were the best counselor I ever had, right, Claire? Wink, wink. You're the best one I ever had. Can I still see you?" And like, well, no, now our roles have changed a little bit because you're not a student here, so I can't really, stuff like that. Um, Again, this is a kind of an important one. Refrain from referring students based solely on the school counselor's personal beliefs, values rooted in one's religion, culture, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. I guess that's not really a dual relationship kind of thing, but it does have something to do with managing boundaries. So that's relevant to say. What else do I want to say about this? I think I'll just leave this here, but do look through this one. There's also a section here on appropriate collaboration, advocacy, and making referrals too. So that'd be a healthy place to look. Okay, let's jump back into our slides. Now, when we talk about risks and benefits here, we're talking about a spectrum of situations, behaviors, and considerations. Okay, so let's see, how do I want to talk about this? Some of us are just innately risk averse, meaning we just don't want to get into weird situations. We think it's just safer to not make exceptions to policy rules, to not consider individual circumstances, because this is just the most fair and it's the most safe for most people. And so I have to stick with that because I can't make, even if it would be good for this one person, I have to do it the way it's good for everybody. So that can lead us to be more conservative, more cautious, and risk averse. That is not a bad thing. So for those of you out there that may see yourself on this side of the spectrum, you're going to be kind of playing it safe, right? And that's going to be a good thing. On the other side, there are people who are like, well, but individual circumstances matter. And in order for us to push boundaries of unfair social programs or bad laws or policies, or to risk the potential benefit to make a self-disclosure to a client or show up at their graduation, as we kind of talked about earlier, or those kind of things, we might be more risk tolerant. And we just have to be aware of that, because there's, again, big risk, big reward. In some cases, you need to be brave and challenge your own fears about what this might do in order to benefit the client. There are cases where that's a good thing. What you can do is think about, where am I along this spectrum? How much am I cautious? I tend to be more cautious, or do I tend to be more of a risk taker? That kind of thing. The detriments is, if you're more of a risk taker, you can do potentially more harm than good, right? If you are more on the kind of cautious side, you might find yourself being legally more safe, right? And by the way, I tend to be more of a risk taker like this, and I say, well, I'm going to care more about individual circumstances. And then there are those situations where I get into binds because of that, and it's the thing that's really great about me, and it's the thing I love because I have the capacity to do that. It's a strength of mine, but it's also kind of an Achilles heel, because there are certain situations where I need to pay more attention to fairness and equity and that kind of stuff. And so I need people who understand how to be more legally cautious and safe and avoid harm, to be around me and rely on them and trust them when I know a weak point of mine, something like that. I'll skip this Catone reference here. There are some other resources to talk about the risks and benefits of all these things, but that's okay. We can go through those later. One of the things that I'll say right above my head here before I get myself out of the way is that if we embrace dual relationships, if we have that risk aversion and we say, I'm not going to get into these, one of the things that can happen is we can say, well, it would be unprofessional for me to show up at your graduation, so therefore I'm not going to do it. And we say, I'm nervous about it, I'm scared, and so therefore I'm going to make the decision based on my own fear, and I'm going to hide behind this professional mask and say I can't do the thing that you're asking for me to do. Which, is that bad? I don't know. That's a decision for us all to make. I think it misses potential opportunities to do really good and beneficial things for clients, but it also keeps you safe. And the question is, are we making decisions in the best interest of the client, or are we making the decisions in the best interest of us? Or could be the case, are we making the decision based on the best interest of the profession because we want our actions to be a reflection of the profession, so we want to be the best version of what we all are supposed to be. So see how this uh, the reason and the intent behind the action makes a lot of difference. Okay. Um, the right behind me here, parent and child, student, teacher, etc., involve hierarchies where multiple roles exist naturally. That's a benefit. Being able to navigate when we have the power to support somebody and do something for them sometimes gives us the, I don't know, permission, if is that the right word, maybe, it gives us the permission to step outside of what we normally would do to help that person. So I'm thinking back of like advocacy like situations where I might be able to do something that really the client should probably do, but they may not have the capacity to do. So then either I do it or it doesn't get done, something like that, which becomes really sticky because some of us are like, oh, I'll just do it. It's so much easier. I have the ability to, whatever. And then we steal away the opportunity for that person to advocate for themselves, to empower themselves. Working through that, there's an okay way to do it and a not okay way to do it. One of the not okay ways to do that is to say, well, I don't I don't want to take on that task, and I'm not doing something for the client's benefit because it's selfishly I'm scared or I don't think I should, whatever. Hard part about that is that you can't possibly do all of the things clients need, and you have to set limits and learn to be okay with that. All right. So there's more conversation to be had about that situation because you have to set boundaries to keep yourself healthy and your client healthy. And that's okay. And it's also a really uncomfortable place to be because sometimes for those of us who think I should be doing more, maybe you shouldn't. For those of you who think like I'm working too hard and I should be doing less, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you need to be doing more. So it's a really difficult thing to talk about here, which is why again, it depends on context. Um, I'm gonna skip over. Oh yeah, I guess I won't skip over this last one. So when we have a professional therapeutic relationship, there are certain things we can't do. We can't we can't expect for the relationship to be completely reciprocal, right? In other words, sometimes clients want to do things with us and for us because they care for us. That's what they do with their friends or family, and we're trying to, build the capacity for them to interact with people. In other words, gift giving is a good example. Uh, you give them the gift of a listening ear, and sometimes clients want to give you things back. Sometimes they're mementos or money or time or whatever it might be, compliments, all that kind of stuff. And it, in some cases, could potentially increase the therapeutic benefit. And you're like, well, maybe I should stretch this boundary just to accept this one little gift. Not a big deal. Say a client gives you, I don't know, a gift card because they were like, out of my birthday, I don't really go to this restaurant. So here, you won't have it because I think you probably would use it more. Do you accept the gift and say, thank you? That was a very generous thing for you to do. Or do you say, no, I can't accept this gift because it's inappropriate for us to accept gifts from clients? Here again, we're kind of toying with that area of hiding behind our professional boundaries. Or is there justification and reason to accept that gift from that person because maybe that's a very therapeutically relevant thing to do, which could provide them benefit, right? You can always take the gift card and put it in a raffle and give it to another client or something that walks through the door. Have people put their name in a hat at the front desk and give it to the person who wins it or something. I don't know. So anyway, okay, let's bring me back and we'll keep rocking. All right. Risks and benefits continued. When assessing for risk and harm, consider these things. Incompatible expectations. I think we've talked about that just slightly here a little bit. Are there expectations that are different depending on the different roles that you're wearing or the different ways the relationship is happening? Okay. I'm not going to give too many examples because I need to keep going, but hold on to that term. Divergent responsibilities, again, objective or subjective, advocate or empowerer, depending on the situation. And then, of course, power differentials. power differentials really matter. Are we trying to, if I'm doing therapeutic work, some people have a different way of doing this than I do, but I tend to want to diffuse power differentials, even in classes here. You guys, I'm like, you guys call me by my first name. I tell you all kinds of weird stuff about me and my life. I try and say, you get to take charge of your education. You hold more power here than I do. Although I'm in kind of an evaluative role, I'm a gatekeeper to the profession, so I have to have some power here, but I try to like equalize that and I say, hey, we're in this together. It's like that in my therapeutic work as well. However, there are certain situations where, let's say, use the example we used in class. Let's say you're my client and you work in the IT department. Then all of a sudden, I'm using your services, and you can hold this, my daughter's laptop, over me, right? So these power differentials. I'm the evaluator, I'm the diagnoser, and now you're the IT person, kind of holding. And the changes in those power differentials that can get really confusing, and that's where a lot of people have a hard time understanding who are we and how do we fit together. Second point down here, boundary crossings and boundary violations. Crossings can happen for benefit or by accident, but the idea is to minimize them, okay? This is probably, I'm gonna get out of the way, pause the video if you wanna read this, if you need to. The idea here is, I keep telling you they can be bad, they can be good. You can be risk tolerant or risk averse, and all of them are good, all of them are okay. And you're probably sitting there just like punching your monitor, wishing it was my actual face. I'm just kidding. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're not doing that. But still, it can be frustrating to not just like say, can't it just be all bad or all good? And now here I'm like, well, you want to minimize the risk. You want to minimize the potential for these things to happen. And there are ways to do that. Even when you're engaging in a dual relationship that you think could be beneficial, you can work to minimize the risk, right? We'll get into examples as we start to look at case studies, but that's something we'll want to keep in mind. Minimize risk as much as we possibly can. That doesn't give you permission, if you're those risk averse people, to say like, well, I'm just minimizing risk. Because remember, your job is to say, I also have to take some risk to provide a good benefit. And if I'm doing that for my own purposes, saying it's to minimize risk in the relationship, then maybe you're missing opportunities to actually be therapeutically relevant in the lives of the people you're helping. So just to make it messier, again, we're sitting in the mess. There will be answers, but not until we have actual clients or actual circumstances that we can work through, okay? So if you see yourself departing from commonly accepted practice, that's probably a good indication that you should really look into this one. Doesn't mean it's bad, again, but it's questionable. Case in point, a lot of people are really interested in things like psychedelic assisted therapy or ketamine assisted therapy, or certain kinds of I'm going to say this really carefully, but sometimes certain religious practices or rituals like prayers or I don't know, smudging if you're a Native American, or I don't know, sometimes even things like taking your shoes off at the door as a cultural practice of either your home or your nationality, or sometimes religious reasons, whatever. Those kind of things, they're not typical expected behavior of counselors, and they can be okay sometimes. But again, they're sort of like, it's a deviation in practice. Probably pay attention to it and see how it may be appropriate or maybe not in the context of your work with your clients in the way that it's happening there. Okay, because it can certainly be a problem if you're setting boundaries or rules that clients really don't need to be following, but they're for your benefit. You know what I mean? So blurred lines lead to a slippery slope and tarnished judgment. Okay, so when you start to get confused and muddled, people do weird things when they get desperate. In other words, when people are in pain and they get desperate, they use coping strategies or mechanisms, and one of them is rationalization and justifying things, saying, oh, it's okay for this reason because, and so that's what we're practicing, pushing ourselves beyond just accepting stubbornly the rationales that we think are that make sense for us right now, and saying, wait, now I'm confused. All this new information. That's on purpose, okay? And then violations are when harm is done. So we're going to use that term of like, we're not really sure if there's a violation yet. What's the harm? And we say, oh, okay, here is the harm that actually happened. Sometimes we don't even get to the harm. We say there's a risk for harm, and there's no violation has been happened. Violations are when licensing boards step in and they say, oh, I'm hearing a report about this person. Let's do an investigation, see if a violation happened. And if they determined it did, then you've violated the ethical code. That's just a little terminology here we're throwing around. Okay. Risks and benefits continued. Apparently, we're going to talk about risks and benefits all day. No, I'm kidding. There's an end to this, I promise. Counselors who are embedded in dual relationships that are unavoidable do not have the luxury of maintaining strong personal or professional boundaries. Okay? So you can say, I'm going to make choices to stay out of these situations, and I can set these boundaries, and I have the choice to do that. And in our role, we have the power to do it as well. But some of them are unavoidable. And in those cases, we don't have that luxury to be able to make those choices. We just are in the situation and we have to tolerate it. That's why we're spending so much time practicing this ambiguity stuff. So the burden to maintain a healthy and mature character lifestyle is higher. And what I mean by that is that it's one thing to say, I'm a counselor at work and I have these boundaries and I have my practice set up this way, and I can go home and do whatever I want, be the kind of person I want. I can get stoned at night and who cares? And I can go out and, go to metal concerts or like orchestra concerts, whatever your flavor is. And I can get a little wild there or whatever, or I can go have like strange relationships with people. You can be a, I don't know what kind of relationship, just whatever it is. Right. And those boundaries are fine. And you get to have those. But when you're in, let's say, a small community and everybody knows everybody, and you're a counselor, if you're out there doing all that kind of stuff, people are going to see all that kind of stuff, and they're going to say, well, I now see you as a therapist, and then I see you as this other person, and that it makes an impression on who the public thinks a therapist is. So when you're doing this kind of work, the question we have to ask ourselves, and this is a discussion, not me telling you how it's supposed to be, it's how much do I have a requirement to live a mature and healthy lifestyle? Or can I say, do as I say, not as I do? I can be unhealthy outside counseling and then tell people how to do healthy living inside counseling. Is that okay? That's a question. I think it's sort of open for debate and conversation. I have no straight answer. I mean, I have my opinions and I'll share them with you, but there's lots of good reasons for me to be wrong too. And I'm open to be convinced, I guess. Okay, let's talk about some of these unavoidable dual relationships. I'm looking at the time. We're at almost 40 minutes, so it's probably going to be a little bit longer, and I apologize. I'll try and keep it rolling here. If you live in rural settings, just like I mentioned in an example, there are fewer degrees of separation between people, and so there's a higher burden for us to be alert and cautious about what these dual relationships mean. Again, there's the question of, is there a higher burden for you to be have your life figured out and to be not doing weird stuff in your spare time, because there's more of a reflection on you and frankly the rest of us too. So rural counselors may not be able to avoid washing their car at a client's business or hiring them to make a fence, right? There's only 3 fence people and one of them is ridiculously expensive and the other one is your client. Is that wrong? That is the question. Maybe, maybe not, and it's context dependent. If you're in the military, there's rank and order requirements about certain relationships. You might not be able to avoid seeing a person who you also have other duties or positions with. Same thing. I'll get to that in a second. Evaluative versus therapeutic. Deeming fitness for deployment is an example. There's a bunch of other examples. One of them I gave earlier from my rehab background. If you are doing like parenting evaluations, that's something I hear a lot about in Wisconsin here, but in Montana, that was a really big one. People going through custody would often be required by the judge to have a parental fitness evaluation. So that changes the role between evaluator versus therapist, that kind of thing. What most people do in those situations, they say, if I've seen you in an evaluative role, I just can't see you as a client. They just set that boundary and make it clear just because it's, easier that way. Keeps your sanity. But some people have deviated a little bit too. In pastoral relationships. So pastors particularly hold unique roles, being pastors, mediators, administrators, staff managers, etc., And also people go to the pastor because that's the person they hear speaking from week to week, or it's the person they think has the most maturity or trustworthiness or something like that. So a few more examples. I think there are a few more. Yeah, there's a few more. The addictions world, uh, this is probably true of veterans as well, but oftentimes counselors are in recovery or have been through recovery, and sometimes those boundaries overlap with of people who are maybe um, still kind of going through the process. One of the examples of that is sponsorship. Um, Sponsors in AA are usually not licensed therapists, but you could see how that would be kind of change the nature of the relationship if you were a therapist, but also in recovery. It just makes things a little bit harder. In-home services, doing non-counseling related duties, getting mail, personal care attendant duties, stuff like that. So that can change those relationships. When I was teaching in rehab programs, that was a lot more of a kind of salient thing. Some counselors would go do like in-home work or in-home evaluations, job coaches sometimes, again, not counselors, but doing work-related kind of things. You might be tempted to sort of jump in and help a person, train them to, I don't know, wipe a table down or, do their laundry or something like that. So it changes the role, right? Again, not all bad. I gave an example of crisis, disaster, emergency. Sometimes you're doing work with people where there's no confidentiality. At the school where there was just a shooting, it's in the Red Cross emergency shelter after a tornado or a flood or something like that. Also, physical boundaries, personal touch. It changes in situations of high crisis, right? It's just different. Hopefully, that's um, self-evident, but we can talk about that too. Interesting fact: 76% of counselors deem hugging as ethical. So I'd be curious to do a little poll here of you guys and see what you think about that. But we'll save that for class. Another interesting issue: bartering or selling product. At first glance, most people that I ask about this are like, "Yeah, that sounds stupid. We shouldn't be doing that. That sounds bad." What if you're a therapist who just wrote a book and you want to put copies of that book out at your therapy center, and you're not going to push the book on people, you're not going to bring it up in sessions and be like, well, as seen on at Barnes and Noble, check this out. You know what I mean? Or maybe you have workbooks that just identify the process that you've been using all along, and you just put a worksheet in your book. Are you now trying to sell your book, or is that just an extension of the work you've already been doing? Or another example that's really common is people selling essential oils or certain kind of like therapeutic, uh, I don't know, like massage tools and stuff like that, or like yoga mats or whatever. People do that pretty commonly. And you say, you know, knock money off of my next session or pay a little bit more for therapy and I'll, let you take home these products. Or, if you give me, uh, you know, bring in a box of cookies or something and I'll give you some of these, like it gets weird and complicated in situations like that. Some people don't think so though. 46.6% of counselors believe that bartering is unethical, and the other half, over half, think it's fine. So again, there's a discussion happening here that's worth having. 47.6% of counselors believe it is okay to sell clients other products like essential oils, books, etc. Question is there coercion involved in that? Are clients feeling pressured to buy things just because they like their counselor so much and they want to support their counselor in their efforts because I'm feeling so supported in mine? Stuff like that. It's weird, right? Some cultures, it is really normal. I'll tell you one from my background in the disability culture. When you have people who make crafts, bead crafts, or they make pictures at their sheltered workshop or their day program, it's really normal for people to say like, "Oh yeah, I'll accept this craft you made. Thanks." Especially if they're not selling them. It's like they just gave it to me because out of the kindness of their heart. Also, a very vulnerable population that is susceptible to giving gifts of things that are worth a lot more money, and it can be potentially really inappropriate to accept gifts. So, uh, depending on how you believe or what you think about that, it might be okay, it may not. Right? Social relationships. In therapy, intimacy goes one way. Friendships are co-equal and equal and reciprocal. We've already kind of talked about that, but we'll dig into that a little bit more later in class, probably. Meeting outside of counseling. This is a big one. Most counselors have some kind of canned speech that says, if we meet outside of this, I'm not going to acknowledge you or look at you. It's not because I don't care or I'm not caring of you. It's that there are some situations where people don't want to be acknowledged. So if you see me in a store, I might make eye contact and nod. I'm not going to approach you. I might not even look at you. So if it seems really cold, it's not because I don't care. There's some kind of speech like that that people have. That's really important to have as a default, like a default that says, I'm not going to treat you, I don't want to out you as a client, so I'm not going to approach you or acknowledge you. But if you approach me, here's what I will do or can do. Because of my roles, I tend to be somebody who says, I'm willing to say hi, high five, but if we get anywhere near talking about anything that we talk about in counseling, I'm probably going to say, let's save that for later. Let's maybe not talk about that. And you have to lead any kind of engagement or action, which sometimes is weird because in counseling, sometimes I'll be doing the talking, the questioning, the guiding, that kind of stuff. So it's worth putting that kind of thing in your informed consent. So we'll do an informed consent assignment in this class. And when you get out and you have informed consent, sometimes there are these like canned versions. You may want to have that conversation with clients. So make a note now in a book that you can come back to later on, something like that. 70% of counselors think friendship after therapy ends is okay, but others caution it. Get out of the way so you can pause it if you want to read that. Others caution, it's not sexual, it's not romantic, so what's the problem? Well, it can be problematic still, right? So I'm not going to dig into that one for the sake of time, but some people just avoid it altogether. Some people say it's okay. It's a conversation to have. More specific examples of boundaries. How about business relationships? If you have a client whose husband is a plumber, are you allowed to use them, even if it's not your client? Or if they're a financial advisor and they know all about your finances? Good questions, right? If it's a small town and there are not that many plumbers versus a big town, does that change your availability and access to other services that might be equally as good? Maybe that changes the way we decide to engage in that kind of relationship. Just an example, what if that plumber all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's my client's husband and I'm sure it's going to be great. And all of a sudden they perform bad services. And you're like, well, I have to make a complaint or have them come back out and work on this. And if they say no, then we're kind of in a conflict. That'd be so weird. I would not want to be in that situation. Lord talked about gifts. Small gifts can be a token of respect and gratitude. We covered that. Small gifts can be very meaningful to clients, like mementos, notes. There's even actually, if you look into narrative style therapies, there are some people that make a point to write notes to their clients and give them to the client to bring home as a gift. And clients then come back and give notes to us as a therapist, or just like journal. And sometimes they hand those in and sometimes they don't. So, depending on how you do your work, there may be therapeutic benefit, also could be weird, right? Just so you can kind of calibrate to what the field expects, 88% of counselors, at least in 2011, say it's unethical to accept gifts over $25. Maybe because of inflation, now that would be $30. Who knows? But it gives you a sense of like, it seems like small gifts under 20 bucks or so, maybe people wouldn't worry so much about that. But again, if somebody does that once and then again and again, could be problematic. I read once on a Facebook post a long time ago in some therapy group that I was a part of. Somebody said like, "Oh, I had a client that tried to give me a car once." Or like, obviously, I didn't take it. But clients can do some things. You might think like, even client would never do that, but some people do some things like that. They absolutely do. Because in other places in life, that may be considered like the biggest form of honor, and it's disrespectful to not accept it. And even though it may feel disrespectful to the client, there are limits to what we can do professionally, right? So, I must have been on some sort of kick when I did this about putting in gifts into the into the slides. But when you're talking about self-disclosure, we addressed this a little bit last week too, so I'm not going to talk too much about it right now. But another fun fact: 87% of ACA members, at least in 2011. Obviously, this chapter was written by somebody who loved this research of Newkrug and Millikan. I actually met that guy at a conference one time. He sells books. He writes other books too, not this ethics book, but nice guy. Anyway, he did this research, and 87% of ACA members back then deemed that self-disclosure is ethical. In other words, self-disclosure can be ethical. Depending on the context, I think that number would change probably, like what kind of self-disclosure, but some form of self-disclosure can be okay. But of course, there's still 13% of people who say, let's just not do it. Just don't. There's no need to, right? If you align more with like a feminist perspective or feminist theoretical orientation, you may say, I can't. I'm trying to use some buzzwords here. The personal is political is a buzz phrase that people use. In other words, like we can't avoid bringing ourselves as if we're the tool of counseling, if we're the people that our presence is what does much of the work and the way we ask questions and the person that we are, we can't avoid bringing parts of that in at least. In other words, we can't avoid dual relationships because and self-disclosing about us and our opinions, especially if we're helping people advocate for social change or inequalities or something like that. So self-disclosure, like, hey, I think there is a bias against women and I'm going to fight for it, or a bias against people with disabilities, which I tend to sort of align with the feminist perspective in the sense that there are power hierarchies and that kind of thing. When I do that, self-disclosure is more appropriate given that theoretical orientation. If you're somebody who is more of like a psychodynamic perspective, you might say, you know what? I'm here to be an objective observer of this person's experience. So they don't need to hear from me at all because I just need to listen to them. If you're a person centered counselor, you might say, my job is to not talk about me, it's to reflect back to them constantly, just all the time, reflect, and let them make decisions about who they are and what they believe and all that kind of stuff. There's just no need for me to be talking about me because that really, according to the person centered therapist, maybe not everybody thinks this way, but it might be just this subtle, almost imperceptible way of getting something out of the relationship that doesn't need to be there. In other words, it's about me, not them. So depending about your theoretical orientation, self-disclosure might be appropriate or it might be not. It's worth a discussion. The risks, I think, we kind of just touched on that, but it primarily meets the counselor's need, some believe. It leads to role reversal in which the client becomes caretaker of the counselor. And that's a big one. And that's one of those places where it can be really insidious and can happen without you even noticing it. In other words, you might say, I'm just, I'm being really open and honest with my feelings. I do this. You guys will hear me do this. I'm being really open and honest with my feelings. And so I'm going to tell you today, I'm just having kind of a bummer of a day. So I think no big deal. I'm teaching self-expression and how inviting vulnerability into the room. However, clients are clients for a reason. And some people are like, I can't help but be a caretaker to people. And because you said you're having a bummer of a day, it's maybe part of my pathology, but I really want to give back to you. In other words, now it's not about me, it's about caretaking for the counselor or professor, whatever. I tend to think that based on my perspective, that leads to good conversations about boundaries and can be theoretically relevant, therapeutically relevant for people to say, hey, that caretaker thing's kind of taken over. Even though I'm having a bummer of a day, I'm okay. I can take care of myself. Let's talk about you. You know what I mean? So again, depends on perspective. The risks is that self-disclosure can lead more to sexual intimacy concerns more than any other boundary violation. So there is a certain intimacy about knowing somebody and seeing them deeply. If you remember back to middle school, high school, or college or whatever, when you're first love and you start finding out things about them, you're like, oh my gosh, me too. We're so much alike each other. And you're in that honeymoon phase. until you get through the honeymoon phase and you're like, oh, the thing that I used to think was wonderful about you is now kind of highly obnoxious. Right? So even when you don't know it, sometimes just sharing about you can lead to clients being drawn in, and just as counselors can be drawn into their clients if we're not careful, in romantic or romantically interested and even sexual kinds of ways. So again, another place where this is kind of insidious. So needless to say, last line here, must benefit the client primarily, if not exclusively. So conversation to be had. We'll leave it there for now. Okay, how many more slides have we got? Let's scan through here. Holy crap. I'm so bad at keeping track of time. We have 5 minutes left. Although I did say that it was going to take longer, so not my fault. I'm kidding. It's still my fault. Talk about physical contact. Again, I'm going to kind of breeze through this one. I think we can talk about it in class, but safe touch, right? We talk about it with kids. We should be talking about it with people who may have the emotional maturity of kids in some cases. When I'm vulnerable, I often act like a child. And what I mean by that is a whole nother conversation to be having. But when my wife really makes me angry, or when I get really sad and lonely because we haven't spent time together, sometimes I can throw temper tantrums like a 4-year-old. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not like laying on the floor screaming, whatever, but I get pouty and I get sad, and we all do this. We regress emotionally when we get into vulnerable situations, right? When we're talking about safe touch, it's not about emotional situations, but physical ones. When we are vulnerable, we tend to want more physical contact, right? Sometimes that can be therapeutically useful, also therapeutically dangerous if we're not vigilant and really understanding what the vulnerability and the risk is here. Safe touch in our culture, handshakes when you meet people, high fives, fist bumps, that might be okay. A hug after successful sessions might be appropriate depending on the context. And we can talk more about what are situations which are just don't do it. Like don't get into the habit of hugging people, going in for a hug, because it can just get real awkward when someone didn't expect it, right? And so just risky, whatever. We can then, again, on the flip side, because I'm being confusing today, fears of the consequences of physical touch are often driven by legal concerns rather than ethical ones. In other words, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to make it a blanket policy. What often happens is you work at an agency that says you can't do it because we don't want to we don't know which one of you counselors, therapists, technicians, whatever, which one of you are weirdos and going to take that and run with it. So we're just not going to do it. What happens, though, is in those situations, sometimes there can be missed opportunities to provide benefit to clients. Now, there are usually ways to work around that and to say, I can't hug in this situation, but here's what I would do if this were allowed. I would give you a hug and say, hey, the things are going to be okay. We're not going to do it right now because this is a boundary I can't cross because these are the rules I need to follow. But I see how you would need this. Are there people in your life that you could get this from, or something like that? The question is, if we're making these decisions for us or they're imposed upon us by somebody, are these for legal reasons? And are those good reasons or not? And what's the benefit of that to the client? So I'm going to think about. Malpractice insurances sometimes ask, that should be asked, not ask if, get myself out of the way, ask if counselors touch clients beyond handshakes due to perceived risk. I've had to ask those questions when I apply for liability insurance. So something to think about. If you say, oh, I think it's therapeutically helpful and necessary, and maybe I'll just lie on my insurance so I can pay less money, you're putting yourself in a weird situation, right? So I won't say anything more about that for now, but it can be risky if we don't understand how it impacts ourselves and others. And frankly, we don't really know how it impacts others most of the time. So again, we're thinking about risk and deciding whether it's a good thing for us to engage in it or not. Okay, let's talk about ethical decision making here for a second. We'll probably go over more of this in class, so maybe we'll skip through some of this. But if there is a dual relationship, get the client's consent to move forward. I'll just skip over that one for the most part. There's a section in our ethical decision making model that says involve the client when at all possible. Um, this is part of that. It's let's talk about this, let's openly discuss, and let's engage the client in understanding what the boundaries are and why they exist. If you do that, oftentimes you avoid problems. You can say, hey, I can't accept this gift, I can't hug, I can't come to your graduation, whatever the thing is. And if we have that conversation, most of the time clients get it and they understand, right? They understand that there are boundaries. They might be hurt by it or sad by it, but they also get it, right? So the better you are at broaching these difficult conversations, the better off you'll be. If you are stuck, you're feeling confused, if you're watching this and you're like, of course I'm confused, you just spent an hour confusing me. and this is how it feels when you get into this for the first time. That's what we as professors, as supervisors, as bosses, as trusted peers, trusted is the key word, not just people who will confide with us or like throw up their hands and be like, I don't know what to do, but people who can help guide you through that, get their perspective. It's invaluable to have good, solid people around you when you get stuck in these weird situations. Document, document, document. Sometimes you might be, you hear this like, if it didn't write it down, it didn't happen. You don't want to write things down. They're going to be to hold you accountable later. So just have phone conversations or supervision conversations, but don't write it down. There are going to be plenty of situations where you need to write things down to protect yourself, to protect your clients, to protect the profession, whatever it might be. And so consider this: document, self-monitor, and know when it's good to write things down and when it's not to. One of the questions is, am I avoiding writing this down because I'm scared of the consequences? That might be something to look into. Plenty of people do it. Question is, are you probably doing something that you shouldn't be doing then? You know what I mean? So if someone could look at it and look at your work and say, this doesn't seem right, it seems unethical, then probably you're doing something that's borderline not okay, and you should look into that. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Obtain supervision for ongoing support. Don't go in without a partner knowing. So if you are going to be in weird situations, bring people in. This is what supervisors and peers are for. I heard a thing about, I don't remember who it was. It was some like Christian leader. I heard it like one of my friends told me once. It was Billy Graham. I think it was Billy Graham. He was like, Billy Graham made it a personal policy to never go into another room with a woman because he knew he had power. He knew that other people were vulnerable. And there's too many instances when people with power, especially in religious situations, can take advantage of people in that vulnerable place. So he made it a personal policy to not go in any room with a person from the opposite sex, especially younger ones, without a witness. So like the equivalent here would be like, you can't really, you have to provide confidentiality, so you can't like leave the door open if there's a precarious situation, but you can ask to record sessions, or you can ask to, ensure that supervisors are aware of the things going on in session. So the best thing you can really do in situations that are like this is just, if you can't talk to people because it's inappropriate to share outside a session, you can write it down, document, document, document in those cases. I've had to do this with people that have kind of like histrionic tendencies, like attention seeking, and oftentimes that turns into like sexual attention seeking, or people blatantly and openly admit that they manipulate others based on their sexual precariousness, that kind of thing. In those situations, document more, write it down, and say, here's what I'm doing to conversations that we're having, and here's our treatment plan, and here's how I'm avoiding problems. Because if you then don't fulfill the interests of the person and they say, oh, he tried to touch me, you can say, well, maybe this is part of their condition and not something that actually happened. So you have a foundation to sort of go back to and say, let me explain why that maybe didn't happen. You know what I mean? All right, we're getting closer. Sexual dual relationships. What do you want to say about this one? It's your responsibility as the counselor to ensure they don't occur, not the client's. Never going to be the client's responsibility. I don't know if you guys remember having these conversations a few years ago on college campuses. There was a lot of talk about sexual violence and sexual violations, things like that. And there was all this discussion about victim blaming. Well, you shouldn't have wore that thing if you didn't want to get raped in an alleyway. I'm being a little bit harsh here on purpose. Um, just because a victim of something participated in a sexual act, we always have the victim always has the opportunity to say no. And even if I was kind of quote unquote asking for it, and give me some grace here with this, because I'm really trying not to project a sense that there's any responsibility from a victim. The person who crosses the boundary is the person who crossed the boundary, right? At any point, I might have been indicating, there's no boundary there, or it's very confusing. But once I set it and say, no, you can't do this, you can't cross it. In this line of work, it's our responsibility to know where those boundaries are because clients are vulnerable and they may not know how to set them or where they are, where they exist. And it's our job to set them for them and to hold to those boundaries. Okay, so um, you this is probably worth a discussion to explain that a little bit more because there are certain times when you might be like, well, the client never said this, and you're like, okay, well, then who's responsible? So there's more discussion there, but most people who engage in this kind of stuff are repeat offenders, probably male, who are going through and experiencing some kind of distress in their personal life. Okay, I've fit this bill before. When you have, let's say, you've just been in a fight with your spouse, and you go to a counseling session. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to do something wrong, but it does make you more vulnerable. And in those situations, having people around who know what you're going through can really help. And you say, in saying like, yeah, I was in a vulnerable place, and here are some people that might be able to help you understand how I was compensating for that vulnerability, by sharing life with them, that kind of thing. Um, Clients who get trapped in dependency on count. What does that even mean? Clients get trapped. Oh, not clients who. Clients get trapped in dependency on counselors, power dynamics, wanting to flee from the abuser but needing them for protection. Again, we can talk about this a little bit more later, but it's just these situations are so complicated. I'll give you one quick story. When I was teaching for the first time, I met somebody who had previously been a counseling client, was in a really difficult time in life, and their therapist took advantage of that, and they ended up sleeping with their therapist. And she explained to me a little bit more about what this was like, of like, he was the person that listened when my spouse or my ex or whatever, when he wouldn't listen, and I had nobody else to talk to, and I really confided a lot of really intimate and vulnerable details about my sadness and about my anger and about my personal life and that kind of stuff, and he took advantage of that. And then we did this thing, and I felt kind of indebted to him, because he cared for me so much, and I cared for him, because that's what happens in these relationships as clients start to care for us. Um, and so it just is a really, really confusing situation. So you have to understand that what your responsibility is in that situation is that clients will depend on you, and they will think this is sometimes a reversal situation where they, if they're in those vulnerable situations, they're caring for you as much as you're caring for them. And they're not, but they don't know how that works. And so enough said about that right now. People that get into these situations, counselors, there's an increased risk for suicide, even clients as well. So something to note. In terms of like, what's the risk? Well, the risk is life or death sometimes. Increasing legal accountability, probably self-explanatory. Um, Meaning it's not just about losing your license, but if you engage in this kind of stuff, you can go to prison for this, and people have, and people should, in my humble opinion. 70 to 95, I'll just keep myself out of here. 70 to 95% of counselors have experienced sexual attraction to clients. Okay, so one thing, this might be worth making a note of if you're still watching this after an hour and 10 minutes. Just kidding. I'm sure you're all still here, just wrapped with attention. You probably paused and got yourself some lemonade and come back and said, I had to take a break halfway through. But anyway, um, you will experience attraction to other people. Attraction is a normal and it's a natural thing. Our bodies do it because we're made to reproduce, and it's okay to be attracted to people. It's also really important that you find people who understand what that means and don't freak out when you say like, I have a really pretty client, and sometimes it's distracting, and they're like, yeah, but I also trust that you're not going to do anything weird about that, or that it's not negatively impacting your ability to be a support to this person, and not like abuse that situation, right? There, a lot of you in this class and other classes are young, attractive, pretty women, right? That's not something that is, that I think anybody who walks in the room could be like, oh, there's some pretty people in here, right? It's okay to have that kind of acknowledgement of the beauty of things in the world that are beautiful, and we have to be uh, have self control and be appropriate with who and how we interact with those people, right? I mean, like I love. Well, what's a good example here? Can't think of a good one, but like I guess maybe I've already said it enough, but it's okay to acknowledge beauty, but you have to do it in a way that shows that it's not something I want to consume or to abuse in the process. So sometimes uh, it's I've had situations before when I was kind of learning about these boundaries for myself. I had another classmate who we were in a class together and we were talking about things kind of like this. And I said, look, I mean, take you for example. You're a very beautiful person, and I'm not attracted to you in like a romantic kind of physical way, but like I think I'm susceptible to all the biases that a male is, that I probably treat you more favorably than others, and other than like people who aren't as normally as attractive. And that did not go over well. And I thought, oh, I'm being pretty like non-biased about this and sort of being vulnerable and saying like we have these internal innate biases. Let's just bring them out and talk about them. And they took that as like an affront to like I was coming onto them and calling everybody else ugly, and it got weird real fast. So how we handle those things is sensitive, right? When I say that it's okay to do that, oh, I'm not even in the screen anymore. When I say it's okay to do that, um, I mean that with the utmost sensitivity, as I would with many of these issues here. Okay, how close are we? Oh, we're almost done. Okay, more of the same sexual dual relationship. What do you do if someone else is doing something unethical? I'll say really quickly, the best thing you can do is report to the licensing board. If that person is not licensed, report to the licensing board anyway and let them deal with it. Licensing board, they all have licensing boards all have attorneys, and attorneys are present and available to handle these kind of situations. You do not need to handle this by yourself. Okay, so there are other things you can do. Um, Depending on if they're your client or not, the client has to be ready and available to put their name on any kind of report that you make. Because if you say, I have a client who said that so and so is, messing around with their client sexually, and you report that to the board, they're going to say, how do we verify this? How do we get some report? Somebody has to sort of make a claim, and we have to be able to talk to them and discuss with them. It can't just be hearsay that came through you about somebody else who, that kind of stuff. It just doesn't go anywhere. Nothing will happen. So sometimes if you hear about these things, it's worth a discussion with clients, because you may be appalled this kind of behavior is happening, but your client is not ready to participate in that. They can't handle the stress of going through this kind of investigation. And so how you handle that is really important, right? So that's worth a discussion in class. We'll save that one for later. That's a good example of intrusive advocacy, advocating on behalf of a client or an issue without client consent, support, or willingness. Okay. Sometimes that can be appropriate, sometimes not. It really depends. It's a good discussion when we talk about things like suicidal risk and things like that. We're often asking the question, is the risk imminent? Somebody in a life or death situation. Sleeping with a client is not a life or death situation, but it is pretty egregious. And so what we consider to be imminent and dangerous, that's a tough one, right? One thing to speak out for general rights. It's another thing to go after a specific person for a specific situation. So just acknowledge that clients can be fearful of participating in stuff like this. And so you may need to spend some time, do some work, and decide whether you're doing work for your own frustration or if it's going to benefit the client in the long run. All right. There's a quote. I'll leave you at that since we're already over time. But thank you for sticking with me. And I'm now going to go and drink water because I've been yakking for an hour and 15 minutes. But that's That's my job. All right. See you guys later. Bye.